about finite state machines. And the first example is to start with 0, 1, the string 0, 1. So you're putting in 0, 1 as the string, and you always start with an arrow. This is the first state. And each state you have to have either a 0 or a 1 coming out of it. So the next one is S1 and S2, because you need 2 arrows. And this is the shortest way to put the string in, so this is your accepting state, which is you can be potentially done. So like I said earlier, each state has to have a 1 and a 0 coming out of it, but because they want us to start with 0, 1, we can't start with a 1 at all. So a 1 automatically fails into S3. Because there's no way you can start with 1 when they ask you to start with 0, 1. So after you know that this state, S0, has a 0 and a 1 coming out of it, you can move on to the next one. And S1 has a 1 coming out of it, but they don't have a 0 coming out of it. And if you put in a 0, it becomes 0, and if you can't have another 0 because it has to start with 0, 1. So if you put in another 0 in between the 0 and the 1, it automatically fails. And now that you have a 0 and a 1 coming out of it, you can move on to the last one. As long as it starts with a 0 or a 1, it doesn't matter what's at the end of it. So a 0 and a 1 can keep looping in there. And finally, your S3, it doesn't matter what goes in here because it already fails. Second example. Second example is, it ends with with 0, 1. So you start again with your arrow. I need 2 arrows to make the shortest. Yeah. And this is the accepting state, because once it has 0, 1, it's basically the end of the string. So it ends with 0, 1, so you can finish it. Okay. So it has to end with 0, 1, so it does not matter what it starts with. So if you have a 1, it can keep looping as a 1 until it hits a 0 and then moves on to the next one. And the 0 can keep repeating in here, because if you have 0, if you have a 0, you move on to this one and you put in a 0 again, a 1 will follow after, which means it still ends in 0, 1. And now that you have a 1 and a 0 coming out of it, you can move to S2. And S2 needs a 0 coming out of it, so we can move this to here. Because if you get a 0 here, you just bring it back here and keep looping it until you get a 1 at the end. And that's the end of it. Okay, the next example will contain 0, 1, 0. So you start with S0 and your arrow, S1, S2, So at S0, you have a 0 coming out of it, but a 1, you would put the 1 here. Because as long as it contains 0, 1, 0, it's still valid. And it doesn't matter what it starts with, so the 1 can keep looping back. And now that you have a 0 and a 1 coming out of it, you can move on to S1. And S1, you can put the 0 back in here as well, because whatever you put in here, you'd move to this state, and this state, if you keep looping a 0, it would still contain a 0, 1, 0. So you can keep looping the 0, and S2, you have a 1 coming in, you have a 0 going out, so you need a 1 to go out. And the 1 can go back here. Because it doesn't matter what it starts with, as long as it contains 0, 1, 0. So now that you have a 1 and a 0 coming out of it, we move on to S3. And as long as it contains 0, 1, 0, it doesn't matter what's at the end, so it can be forever looping. The last example will start with 0. And contain exactly 1, 1. Start with your arrow. And the shortest string could be 0, 1. So because it says you have to start with 0, whatever, if you put a 1 in, it automatically fails into S3. And now S1, you need a 0 coming out of it, and you can keep looping the 0 into it, because the only requirement is for it to start with 0. It never said whatever was in between couldn't be a 0, so you can keep looping that. And it contains exactly 1, 1. So you need a 0 coming out of this, and it doesn't matter. It never said what it ends with, so this is also a val. And now you need a 1 coming out of S2. But it can only contain 1, 1, so it automatically fails if you have another 1. And S3, you require a 0 and a 1 coming